Thanks, Alfred. While I, yes, let's go to the floor again for some questions.
Hi, hello, good afternoon. This is Noemi Jimenez from Philips Healthcare. Looking at the, and I apologize in advance, but looking at the lack of diversity of our panel, I was encouraged to look at some data between China and India. And I realized that 95% of the girls in China have access to education, and they're in primary school, whereas 40% of women aged 15 to 24 are illiterate in India. And also 60% of women in China are in the labor force, whereas only 23% of Indian women are in the labor force. So this kept me wondering that when we talk about investment, I was wondering whether maybe more gender equality and more involvement of the women force in India would be the key factor to close that economic gap that we're talking about. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks. There was one more question. I'll take that and then come back to the panel. Yeah, the gentleman here.
Well, thank you. My name is Karthik Nachif, and I'm a fellow at ISAS. I mean, when thinking about India, one issue that always comes up is migration. So people moving from the northern, western, other parts of India to the south, where the economies are doing relatively well. I'm wondering how much does that shape into your analyses of what's happening in that sector and how states can also figure some of these questions out with each other? Thanks.
Great. So we have two more questions on India, and before I get to the panel on those two, actually, Kwee, I had one question for you. We've talked a lot about India. Now, from your perspective as an investor, and you mentioned obviously GIC has investments in both of these, what are the major issues that you see right now in China from the investor's perspective? We have talked about a fair bit on India. I'd like to hear the Chinese side.
Hello. It's okay now? Okay. Yeah, okay. So for the China side, I think most investors are concerned about near-term cyclical kind of economic trajectory, especially on how the government is going to solve the triangular problem between property, local government, and the banking system's potential NPL. So what happened over the last 2.5 months in September, we actually see a very convincing pivot on the central government side to be more decisive in giving a helping hand to the local government, and also potentially introducing more property sector stabilization measures. And of course, there's going to be a 1 trillion bank recap bond going to be issued probably next year. So in that sense, the market has reacted quite decisively after running up 30 to 40% from the depth or from the trough of in mid-September. Right now, after 10-15% correction, both the Asia market and the Hong Kong market is still up 20 to 30%. And then of course there are new uncertainty coming from the U.S. new regime, but basically the market is convinced that the Chinese government has actually removed the downside risk from the economy and the banking system.
Great, good to know. Ranil, thank you. Thanks, Kwee. Ranil, you want to take the question on gender equality?
Sure. I think we at the IMF, we've done work exactly on the points you've made, and said the importance of narrowing gender gaps in a country like India. We've also done it for many other countries. So yeah, India, there's both education gap as well as a female labor force participation gap. Education, I think, is a broader issue in India, as I tried to highlight. India is very good at skilling a top tier, but the education system overall is not good. So one is girls are not getting enough opportunity. That's an important, partly that could be a cultural issue, but you also have to create schools that better train when the girl or boy comes into the school. And that's a key. As I mentioned, India, by our analysis, actually spends enough money on education. It's just poorly allocated. So what we've heard in that context, we're not experts on education, but there are a number of issues, including the appropriate curriculum for students. But more than that is also teachers turning up to work. And also students. So part of the issue, I think, especially in rural India, is children don't come to the school, and more so girls. So that's a little bit of a problem. The numbers on female labor force participation are not as bad as 23%. They've recovered somewhat in the last few years. I believe it's above 40% now, but that's still low, right? That's not high. So I wouldn't say that's an achievement. In addition, as I showed in my slide, the types of jobs that women are getting are as family workers or own account. Now, own account could be gig workers, but I don't think so because it's mainly rural India. So the type of jobs that are being created for women are not sufficient. So we fully agree with your comments there.
Yeah, thanks, Ranil. Just one point on the gender issue. There's also a big divide between North and South, and there's a much higher female labor force participation in South India as compared to what it is in North India. Depends. And
the migration question.
That's the migration question. So this is a natural segue into the last question that we have, and Taimur yours.
But just as a rejoinder, there's also a huge issue of missing millions of women in the north of India. Amar Sen has written about it, and I don't think that has changed that profoundly in India yet. So that also is one of the leading cause of gender disparity in the north of India, not so in the south of India. In terms of migration, it's been 4 years since the pandemic, but we've forgotten everything. We've forgotten about the Delta wave that affected India. We've forgotten about those images of thousands of migrant workers from the western part of India having to walk hundreds, if not 1,000 miles back to their villages because there was no way to go. So that tells you that, well, beyond the fact that we've forgotten about the pandemic, is that migration is a very profound dynamic within India. It is also a very big thing in China, but China formalizes that. You have to have a hukou to own property in a state. If you don't have, come from a different state, there's a different tax treatment, there's different residency treatment. It's laxer in India. Anybody can technically show up wherever they want to go and build a life. There is no special paper required as stringent as it is in China. But at the same time, the migration dynamic affects politics profoundly, and it has for decades. It's not a new thing. There are non-Hindi speaking states where people don't like Hindi-speaking people coming and working at the lower end of the income spectrum. In a way, it kind of sounds like some of the rhetoric that comes out of the United States. The issue related to white-collar workers, I think, is less friction, has less friction. Because if you go to a place like Bangalore is like the New York of India today, or Silicon Valley of India today. Kids from all over India coming to work in the tech industry and having a very high quality of life, and you'd never hear about discrimination against Hindi-speaking versus non-Hindi-speaking people. They're all there as English-speaking workforce, and they're all doing very well. But when it comes to blue-collar worker, it sows seeds of social tension time to time, and as the country starts going through big manufacturing wave, if you will, a lot of the manufacturing will be on the blue-collar side, and the migration dynamic would be an issue. Where do people want to work at a certain reservation wage? Is it in the north or the south? Where do we have the best infrastructure? Is the same mapping or not? As an entrepreneur, do you want to build at a place where education attainments are low, but there's plentiful labor? Or do you want to build at a place where education attainment is high, but reservation wage is also very high? So this is where the beauty of India's federal system comes in. There should be mechanisms for internal equalization of factor and wage productivity through migration. Doesn't quite happen that well yet. The country is a country of tiny countries. The ethos in the south is very, very different from the ethos in the north. You may call it India, but it's very, very different. And therefore, seeds of culture does get into place. It's not as homogeneous as other places. So India's heterogeneity is India's strength and beauty, but it also gets in the way of the seamless migration dynamic, even though it is not as stringent as it is in China.
Thank you, Taimur. I'll just add to that. I come from a city called Hyderabad, which is in the south, and it is the last city when you start up from north going down south where you do not need to learn the local language. Hindi is just fine. And that's what has a huge inflow of blue-collar migration that basically stops in Hyderabad. It has a lot to do with the fact that you don't need to learn any other language. Anyway, with that, we'll have to close this. It's been thanks to all the panelists. Maybe we could give them a big hand. Thanks for all your contributions. And thanks to all of you, the audience, and thank you for your active participation. Thank you for listening to all the presentations, and we look forward to having you join us in the next event that we have. Thank you very much.